Thank you, Mr. Lally. Go ahead.
Thank you. Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Your Honor, the court would seek to introduce, well, let me. Those pages that I've just placed before you, do you recognize the content of those?
I do.
And what do you recognize those?
They are text messages between myself and John.
And from sort of specifically that time period of the early morning of January 29th to the morning of January 29th?
Yes.
And what's contained in those, is that a accurate portrayal of content of those text communications?
Yes.
Now, with reference to Mr. O'Keefe, this is someone that you knew and you had his information put into your phone as far as contact.
Yes.
And on prior occasions when you had contacted, or specifically that morning when you had left the waterfall and you talked to him on the phone, you called him, and who answered? You called the contact that you had as John O'Keefe, correct?
Yes.
Okay, who answered the phone?
John.
Okay. And then the contact that you had put in as John O'Keefe called you, and you answered, and who was on the other line?
John.
Okay. Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
I'll seek to introduce in a minute.
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. This is subject to what we talked about in sidebar?
Yes, understood.
Thank you. That's Exhibit 89, Your Honor. All right, thank you.
Your Honor, with respect to what's now been marked as Exhibit 89, if I could, with the court's permission, publish that to the jury.
Yes.
Okay, what's up on the screen, is that what you have before you as that exhibit?
Yes.
And this is a text communication between yourself and Mr. O'Keefe, correct?
Correct.
Your Honor, I'm sorry, Ms. May we approach you?
Sure, why don't you take that down, Ms. Gilman?
Thank you, Ms. Gilman. So, Mr. Kay, with what's before you and what's up on the screen as the exhibits, there are sort of green bubbles and blue bubbles, correct?
Correct.
And can you tell the jury as far as who's communicating which direction, as far as the green bubbles are who and the blue bubbles?
Green is John and blue is myself.
And so the first text from this particular date, if you could just read to the jury as far as from whom the message is sent, what the content is, and then what the time period is.
So John sent to me where to at 12:14.
And if it's you, if you have that in front of you.
Okay.
So the next bubble down is a blue bubble, is that correct?
Correct.
Similar to the one before, can you just read as far as that, well, before I get to that, though. So you received that message from Mr. O'Keefe, you call him, have a conversation, he calls you back for the conversation.
Correct.
And then subsequent to that, can you read the next blue bubble down as far as from whom, what content is, and what time it is?
So this one is from myself to John, and it says here at 12:27. So at that point, I see a car out front, and I text him here.
Testify to as far as looking out the front storm door, seeing a car, then you sent a text. That's the text.
Correct.
And Ms. Gilman, if you could scroll down to that. And ma'am, similar, if you could just, who sent it, what's the content, and what is that time?
I sent to John, pull behind me at 12:31.
And what were you referring to when you said hold on?
So at this point, the car had moved from the prior spot where I originally saw it. So I thought, what is he doing? Why don't they just pull behind me in the, in the driveway?
Hold down. And again, with this bubble, you could read out.
From me to John saying hello, and it was at 12:40.
And at this point in time, as far as, let me ask you this way. When you're sending these text messages over these periodic time periods, what, if anything, are you doing sort of in between?
So I would go, I originally went to the front door, saw the car, texted them, then texted John. Then I went back, kind of sat at the table, just either threw my phone probably in my back pocket. And then a couple of minutes later, I got up again and saw that the car had moved. So I had sent the, the pull behind me. And then a few minutes later, I went back to the window, to the front door, I'm sorry.
And when you went back to the front door, what, if anything, did you see at that?
So at this specific point at 12:40, when I say hello, I cannot be certain whether they were still out front or if they had left.
And from any of these text messages that you sent, what kind of response did you receive from Mr. O'Keefe after where to?
None.
Ms. Gilman, if you could, to the next level. And similar to the prior one.
Sure. Jen to John, where are you? And that was at 12:42.
Next level.
Myself to John, hello, at 12:45.
Now, this is later in the morning, and we'll get to that a little bit more in a moment, but at some point you left the residence of Fairview, you went home, and you were woken by something, and then at some point you texted John later on that morning, the 29th.
Yes.
And are these the next couple of those text messages that you sent at that point?
Correct.
And you could just, similar to the other ones we've used.
Myself to John, please answer at 4:59. Myself to John, Karen is worried, we need to find you at 4:59. Myself to John, please answer so I know you're okay, 5:04.
Now, may I approach this retreat?
Yes.
Now, Ms. McCabe, I can take you back to at the house on Fairview. Again, you're sending these text messages and going back to the table and then going back to the window at various times.
To the front door.
To the front door.
Yes.
And at any point in time, do you see anybody exit from the dark SUV or the black SUV you see in front of the house?
No.
And at any point in time, did John O'Keefe come into the house?
No.
And at any point in time, did John O'Keefe respond to your text messages?
No.
At any point in time, did John O'Keefe call?
No.
Now, at some point subsequent to this, have you had occasion to look at your phone or at your call history?
Yes.
And through review of that, were you able to see phone calls that your phone made to John O'Keefe's phone around that same time frame that you were texting him and going to his phone?
Yes.
May I approach, Ron?
Yes.
And I'm showing you a 4-page document. Actually, look at it, look up when you finish, and if I could suggest, I think it starts in reverse order from page 4, timing-wise, up through page 1. Just generally speaking, ma'am, do you recognize what's contained in that 4-page document?
I do.
And what do you recognize it to be?
The calls between myself and John O'Keefe.
And am I correct that it starts in sort of a ascending order as far as the most earliest calls are on page 4 and then the most recent are on the first page?
Yes.
And the phone calls that you were testifying to about before, as far as talking to him on the way from the waterfall to residence at Fairview, did they appear in those?
They do.
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach before?
Hey, may I have that?
Okay, as far as the first calls that you were testifying about, as far as when you spoke to Mr. O'Keefe on the way from the waterfall to the residence at Fairview, were those contained within those calls?
Yes.
As far as, is there a time that's associated with those calls that you observe in those 4-page documents?
Yes.
And what other?
12:14 and 12:18.
And turning your attention to page 1, that would be sort of the last in line there. What time is the last call between yourself and Mr. O'Keefe, and who's calling?
I'm calling him at 5:25.
Okay. May I approach him?
Yes.
Almost seeking to introduce him as the next exhibit.
Is there any objection?
There's not, Your Honor. Thank you.
Exhibit 990. Thank you.
Now, Ms. McCabe, you had mentioned that during the course of the evening, shortly after you arrived at the residence at Fairview, you observed a vehicle outside of your sister's house, correct?
Yes.
And Your Honor, with course permission, I would ask to publish with this witness Exhibits 71, 72, and 73.
Okay.
And Ms. McCabe, first and foremost, what's up on the screen is Exhibit 71. Do you recognize that?
I do.
Okay, I think you can just go right to what you wanted to identify, please, Mr. Lally.
So, Ms. McCabe, in front of you on the desk, there should be a laser pointer. Just click on the button and point to the screen. And if I could ask if you could direct, well, first and foremost, with respect to this photograph, do you observe in this photograph where you first saw the black SUV in front of the house?
It was directly if I was staring out the front door. So this angle is kind of unique to see it. But if you go from the front door directly straight out, so maybe the edge, you understand what I'm saying?
Using that as direct attention.
So if there's the front door and I look straight out. But the perception is almost like a side view. It's not straight on, so it could have been a little over here.
So why don't you show another picture if this one isn't helpful?
I'm going to play that exhibit. Is it visible in this photograph?
Yes, so just be follow this and then come straight.
And lastly, Exhibit 73. Now, Mr. McCabe testified that at another point you come to the front door and you observe the vehicle in a different spot, correct?
Correct.
If you could, again, using the laser pointer, just direct your attention to where in this photograph, if at all, you observe with the vehicle in a second.
It was right about right near the flagpole.
Okay. Just going to need to take that. Now, turning your attention to back in the home, at some point you indicated you looked out and didn't see the black SUV there anymore.
Correct.
And what was your thought as far as where John was or where John had gone at that point?
At that point, I thought maybe they decided not to come in. Maybe they got into an argument, or maybe Kaylee had called.
Did you think much of it at that point?
No.
Now, you leave the home around what time?
approximately 1:30, roughly 1:30, 1:45.
And when you leave, who, if anyone, goes with you?
So it's myself, my husband Matt, and I had offered, when Julie Nagel's brother had come to the house earlier, I had offered Julie and Sarah Levinson a ride home because we had just gotten there and they had wanted to stay later. So I also drove home Julie and Sarah. Well, my husband drove them home.
And so you exit the house, go out to the vehicle, correct?
Correct.
And your husband Matt was driving?
Yes.
And where are you seated in?
And the front seat.
And do you recall where Ms. Levinson and Ms. Nagel were seated in the car?
They were in the back seat.
Do you recall which one was on which side?
I do not.
And when you come out of the house and you're starting to go home, what, if anything, had changed as far as the weather from when you had gone in to when you had come out?
The snow had, accumulated more.
And when you get into the vehicle and as the vehicle is pulling away, what, if any, conversations do you recall having with anyone in the car?
When I got in the car, I kind of turned around to Julie.
I'm going to allow that subject to moving strike. There's a portion that's relevant. Go ahead.
I turned around and was facing them and talking to them. And I believe Sarah Levinson had laughed or made a joke because I had bread or something in my car. And we made a joke about that. I had my niece earlier that week for the week. And so I had brought stuff in the car because I was dragging her from one of my kids' sporting events to the next.
And as do you recall which direction, or did you observe which direction your husband Matt exited from residence in Fairview? And by that I mean, did he head towards Chapman or did he head towards Sucre?
Chapman.
And so as far as, I may not have asked this before, but as far as the black SUV that you observed in front of the house, which direction was that vehicle facing?
Chapman.
Each of the times that you saw it?
Yes.
And so as with that vehicle, as with the one that your husband was driving, which side of the vehicle would have been closest to the house in Fairview?
Passenger.
Now, as you're driving past the house, heading past the house, how were you positioned within the car?
I'm turned chatting to the girls.
So, and when you're turned, are you turned towards the window or are you turned towards the console? Which way are you turned?
Turned the console towards the back seat. So my back is to the window.
And either of these girls, did you know where they lived?
No.
Do you recall whether or not you found their homes by way of sort of GPS, or was it just sort of verbal directions?
I'm assuming they just gave Matt directions to where they lived.
And so you drop each of them off. Do you recall which order they were dropped off?
Julie, then Sarah.
And then following dropping off Sarah, where did you and your husband go?
Home.
And this whole trip, sort of from Fairview to dropping off Ms. Nagel, Ms. Levinson, and then going home, about how long a period of time is that?
It could be 20, 30 minutes, approximately, maybe about approximately 20 minutes. I'm not exactly sure.
You arrived home sometime after 2 a.m., is that correct?
Yes.
And when you and your husband Matt got home, went inside the house, and where did you go?
I went upstairs to bed.
And at some point, did your husband come up as well?
He did.
Was it a long period of time between when you arrived home and when your husband came up?
I don't think too long. I think he had like some cheese or something because he was on a crazy diet, and then he came upstairs.
Now, did you go right to sleep, or what, if anything, did you do when you went up to bed?
I asked him to watch a show. He said no, he was going to fall asleep, which he does usually immediately, and I went on my phone.
And what, if anything, do you recall doing on your phone as far as going on?
I was researching, my husband and I did briefly talk. My daughter had gotten an offer to play on club
Just tell us what you were doing, please.
Sure. I was researching a basketball team, and I believe I also texted my sisters, and I texted in a group chat with my husband and another individual.
Now, if I could just turn your attention back to when you were at the house on Fairview that evening, and I believe this is the last time, so I apologize for the back and forth, but when you were there, what, if any, videos or any music or anything did you pull up on your phone to share with the group that you were there?
So one of my sisters loves the song Raining Men, and she always, well, not always, maybe every once in a while, she has a little too much to drink and takes out an umbrella and sings and dances, and it's like a big family joke. And my other nephew had previously been over and showed me the video from whenever, I don't know if it's the 1970s, of It's Raining Men. So I just was playing it, showing my other nieces and nephews, and we were just like laughing because they all have umbrellas, and it's just something, it's like an inside family joke. So I played that, I think, a couple of times.
And so after you get home and you're looking at the basketball program and things of that nature, what, if anything, else did you do before you went to bed? Or went to sleep, I should say?
Nothing. I possibly could have gotten up to go to the bathroom. I do that almost every night.
Now, at this time you had an iPhone, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you also have an Apple Watch?
I did, yes.
And do you recall whether or not you were wearing the Apple Watch that evening or when you went to bed or anything like that?
I do not recall.
And as far as the Apple Watch is concerned, is that something that you routinely or always take off before you go to bed? Or not?
Mostly, but not always. I mean, there are times I go to bed with it on. More often than not, I take it off, but there are times that I do sleep with it.
And with respect to this particular evening, do you recall whether you had it on or whether you took it off or even had it on at all that night?
I don't recall if I had it on that night.
Now, turning back to that last exhibit as far as the phone calls were concerned, were there certain phone calls that you made to Mr. O'Keefe's phone around the time that you were observing the vehicle outside?
Yes.
Do you recall making any phone calls to Mr. O'Keefe at that time?
I don't.
Fair to say that at no point while you saw the vehicle outside did you have any conversation with Mr. O'Keefe?
I didn't.
Now, you go to sleep, and at some point later on in the morning, you wake up, correct?
Correct.
And what is it that wakes you up, and when about was that?
I woken up to my phone ringing.
And do you know what time it was?
4:53.
And according to your phone, who was calling you at 4:53?
John's niece.
And so that would be John's niece, Kaylee, is that correct?
Correct.
And how old was she at this time?
I believe she was 14.
And she had just gotten into Bishop Thean, correct?
Correct.
So she was in 8th grade going in, finishing up her 8th grade year of middle school, correct?
Yes.
Is that a normal thing, that Kaylee would be calling you at 4:53 in the morning on a Saturday?
No.
So you answer the call, is that correct?
Yes.
When you answer the call, who, if anyone, is initially on the other end?
Initially, it's Kaylee.
And what, if anything, did Kaylee say to you?
That John didn't come home and Karen and we wanted to talk to me.
And even in that initial call, when you're speaking to Kaylee, what, if anything, do you hear sort of in the background when you're talking?
Karen screaming.
And could you hear what she was screaming?
She was just screaming, Jen, Jen, Jen!
Fairly loudly, is that correct?
Extremely.
Now, at some point, does the defendant get on the phone with you?
She does.
And what, if any, conversation do you have with her then?
She proceeds to scream my name multiple times, and she tells me that John didn't come home, they got into a fight, and that she left him at the waterfall.
And how do you respond?
I had just woken up. I was confused. I didn't know what she was talking about. I was like, what? What are you talking about? And then she, told me that they had gotten into a fight and she left him there and now where is he? And she was just kept screaming my name over and over. And so then I remembered that Chris Albert had still been at the bar. So I thought, well, maybe John walked home with Chris because Chris lives close to the waterfall.
And so at some point that conversation ended and you recall how that ended?
I told her that I was going to call Julie and see if John had ended up with Chris.
And so you hang up with her, and then what did you do then?
I called Julie Albert.
And did Julie pick up the phone?
She did not.
And as you were calling Julie, did you have any conversation with your husband, Matt, around that time?
Yes. He, had kind of shot up out of bed when Karen had called, when Kaylee had called because Karen was screaming. And then he was, what's going on? And I said, well, I'm calling Julie because Karen, they got into a fight and I was trying to explain it to him. And he said, what are you talking about? We saw them outside of your sister's house. And at that point, I hung up.
And when you hung up, Julie had not answered yet, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, as far as Miss Reed, is that someone who had your phone number? Did you have her plugged into your phone as a contact before that date of January 29th?
No.
You never had any kind of conversation with her over the phone as far as a text or a phone call or anything? You didn't even have her information?
Correct.
And so after hanging up while calling Julie, what, if anything, did you do then?
And then I'm not sure if I called Kaylee back or if Kaylee called me back.
At some point, you get back in touch with Kaylee or at least her phone, correct?
Yes, I get in touch with Karen again, and I say, Karen, we saw you outside of my sister's.
And what was her response to that?
She told me that she didn't remember going there, and then she started yelling, Jen, Jen, and then she was saying, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And then she proceeded to say that she had a cracked taillight.
And this is while you're still in your home and you're in your bedroom, correct?
Correct.
And what was your response to that?
I thought she was honestly like just talking crazy. And then she said, oh my God, I left him there. Like she was extremely irrational. She said that it told me again that they had gotten into a fight. So now she was just kind of all over the place, just screaming. She was very hard to understand. So my brain started going, okay, well, if she left him there, where could he be? Who could he be with?
And as you're going through that sort of process, what did you do next?
So then earlier in the night, there was another individual who we had been in contact with, or my husband had been talking to, and he had mentioned that he was going to meet up with John at Waterfall as well, but he never ended up coming. I knew he was at a house close to Fairview, so I thought, well, maybe if they got into a fight, like John might have texted this individual, and maybe he just ended up on his couch.
Who was that individual?
Tom Beatty.
And who is Tom Beatty in relation to, how did you know him?
He has two daughters that are the same age as my daughters.
One of those daughters, at least around the same age as Kaylee?
Yes.
And so, based on sort of that process, thought process and what you're doing, what did you do then?
So then I started calling Tom.
And at any point in time that you called Tom, did Tom pick up the phone? Did you speak with him?
He did not.
And so, following that, what did you do from there?
So I know at some point I was starting to call John. My husband was as well. At that point, I get up and I'm like, okay, well, we got to go out and look for him. And in my head, I was thinking I'll drive over to Tom's and maybe he's there. I then go downstairs. Matt gets up. He's starting to get dressed. I go downstairs. I make a coffee. And I'm not sure how much time passed, but then all of a sudden I hear screaming out front.
Now, if I could just take it back for a second, as far as a decade or so that you had known and been friends with John O'Keefe, with his either his niece or his nephew or both home, is him not coming home, is that something that had ever happened before, you were ever aware of before?
I was never.
Ask it differently.
Had John ever gone out at night and then not come home and get home?
Objection.
I'm going to allow it.
Not to my knowledge, no.
So at some point you make your way downstairs, is that right?
Correct.
And then what, if anything, did you hear once you were downstairs?
Screaming
And where was the screaming coming from?
out front.
And when you heard that screaming, where did you go?
I ran to my front door.
At some point, did you open your front door?
I opened my front door, correct.
And then what did you see when you opened the front door?
Miss Reed came running up my walkway.
And prior to, during any of the other conversations that you had with Miss Reed, did you know where she was when you were talking to her?
No.
Obviously, the first call was Kaylee calling from the house. That
Yes.
Was the
Mhm.
assumption. And then
So
subsequent.
is that a yes or no?
Yes.
And as far as the second call that you were talking about, do you know where she was when she was talking to you next?
The first couple calls, I know she was at the house, and then I don't know.
So was opening your door, hearing the screaming from out front, was that something that surprised you?
Yes.
And when you hear the screaming, if you could, just explain to the jury, how loud was the screaming that you were hearing?
Very loud.
And what, if anything, was she saying?
It was more of the, Jen, did I hit him? And then she would yell, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And then she was yelling, we have to go to Fairview.
And in addition to Miss Reed, what, if anything, else did you see when you opened up the door?
Just,
That's in a better way. Did
yeah.
you see a vehicle?
yes,
And where was the vehicle and what did the vehicle look like?
it was in my driveway. I believe the driver door was left open.
And what kind of vehicle was it?
A black Lexus.
Consistent with what you had seen outside of Fairview the night or earlier in the morning.
Yes.
And so as she's coming up your walk toward your front door,
Running, yes.
and then what, if any, conversation did you have with her there in reference to that?
I just said, Karen, Karen, I was trying to calm her down. Matt came, I believe, and was yelling down that she was going to wake up the neighborhood. And then she was yelling that we had to go to Fairview. So I told Matt that I was going to go with Karen.
Initially, before that, what were your plans as far as going to look for John before Miss Reed showed up?
My husband and I were going to go to Tom Beatty's.
Now, once you decide that now you're going with Miss Reed, the defendant, where did the two of you go?
So as we walked out, there was a car pulled up and then a plow.
Recognize the car pulled up?
No.
And I'm sorry, I interrupted. So the car pulls up and then the plow, and then what happened?
So in the car was Kerry Roberts. And so she kind of rolled down the window and was like, Karen, what are you doing? And then the plow was behind her. So Kerry pulled up and I believe I told Karen that I was going to drive her car because I didn't want her driving because she was hysterical. So we got in her car and then Kerry Roberts called Karen. And then Karen was screaming and, saying that she had cracked her taillight. We need to go to Fairview. Could I have hit him? Did I hit him? And then she would just scream our names. Kerry was telling her to shut up, that we needed to just go back to John's and we'll drive in one car and let's go to John's. Maybe he's there and he's passed out and you didn't see him.
Now, when you open up the door initially and you come outside and you see the defendant out there screaming and all that, again, with respect to the weather, what was the weather at that?
It was like dark and it was almost like a whiteout.
And so you get into Ms. Reed's vehicle, correct?
Yes.
And you're driving that vehicle from your house to Meadows Ave, is that correct?
Yes.
That's Mr. O'Keefe's house?
Yes.
You're familiar with that residence? You've been there plenty of times before?
Yes.
Now, with respect to Kerry Roberts, did you know Kerry Roberts prior to this morning of January 29th?
I had met her once before.
And can you describe to the jury sort of the circumstances of that or how you knew her prior to January 29th?
Way back when, after John's sister and brother-in-law died, I would have Kaylee a lot and Kerry would have Patrick. And one day John said, I get a discount at Reebok. I'm going to take you guys for sneakers. Get all your kid sizes. So he took Kerry and myself and we went to Reebok and bought sneakers for all my girls and me. And then he took Kerry and I to the hillside for lunch just to thank him for, helping. Because that's what he did.
Now, was Kerry Roberts someone that you had as contact saved in your phone? Had you ever texted her or called her or talked to her over your phone before?
No.
So you indicated that Ms. Roberts then calls Ms. Reed's phone while you're in Ms. Reed's car, correct?
Yes.
Now, as far as that, Ms. Reed's phone, was that similar to your phone earlier in the morning? Was that hooked up in any way or matched or paired with the vehicle that you were driving?
Yes.
So fair to say you could hear both sides of the conversation as far as Ms. Reed talking next to you and then obviously Ms. Roberts on the other end?
Yes.
So the conversation that you were talking about as far as Ms. Roberts saying, shut up and we're going to Meadows Ave and all that, you could hear Ms. Roberts saying that?
Yes.
Now, the vehicle, when you get into the defendant's vehicle, she pulled in straight into your driveway, is that correct?
Yes.
So fair to say you had to back out of the driveway, correct?
Correct.
Now, when you were operating Ms. Reed's vehicle in reverse, what, if anything, showed up in sort of the center console area of that vehicle?
I do not remember. I don't know.
Do you recall anything as far as the camera or anything like that?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
You back the vehicle out of the driveway, you proceed to Meadows Ave, correct?
Yes.
And about how long a drive is it from your house to Mr. O'Keefe's?
Approximately 5-6 minutes.
And when you get to Mr. O'Keefe's house, where do you park?
I pull in straight in the driveway.
And after you pull into the driveway, at some point you all get out, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall who pulled in first as far as who was in front of who on the way to Meadows, yourself or Ms. Roberts?
I believe I was in front.
You would have pulled in the driveway and parked, and Ms. Roberts would have pulled in and parked behind, correct?
Yes.
And so after the three of you get out of your respective vehicles, what happened next?
Karen brings us to the back of the car and she says, look, see, I have a cracked taillight.
And where on the vehicle was she directing yourself and Ms. Roberts' attention?
The back right.
The passenger side, rear part of the vehicle.
Yes.
And when you looked at that area of the vehicle, what could you see at that?
I saw that there were missing pieces, but there was also snow covering it. And Karen was screaming, look, look. And then Kerry was screaming back at her. It was very chaotic. So I didn't stare in depth, but what I can tell you is I saw missing pieces from the taillight.
And at some point, about how long a period of time is this that you're out in Mr. O'Keefe's driveway looking at the cracked taillight?
Not long, because then Kerry's, yelling at her, telling her she's crazy and that she was driving around drunk and she could have hit anything, and kind of rushes us to go into the house to look in there for John.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask that if I could publish on the screen what's been marked as exhibit number 2.
Okay.
And Mr. Gabe, do you recognize what's up on the screen?
I do.
What is it?
That is Meadows Ave, John's house.
And the driveway that you're talking about as far as where you pulled in, that's not visible in this photograph, correct?
Correct.
So from facing Mr. O'Keefe's house on Meadows, which side of the photograph would the driveway be, the left or the right?
The right.
And Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
I'm just showing you another photograph. Just ask you to look at that. We'll finish.
Okay.
And you recognize what's in that photograph?
Yes.
What do you recognize?
That's John's car.
And where is John's car in relation to John's house?
It's parked to the side of the driveway.
And you also see sort of the garage area in that photograph?
Yes.
May I approach?
Yes.
I'm going to seek to introduce in a minute to the next.
No objection.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, if I could publish that to the jury now as well.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Cave, with reference to what's up on the screen is that photo that you just had for you.
Yes.
And there are 2 garage doors on the house at 1 Meadows Ave, correct?
Correct.
Left and right, is that fair way?
Yes.
And you've been inside Mr. O'Keefe's house a number of times before, correct?
Yes.
Now, with respect to the garage door on the left, what was contained within that part of the garage?
His old-fashioned car.
What the Haley didn't like?
Yes.
And on the right side of the garage, what if anything was in there?
It's pretty open.
How would you describe Mr. O'Keefe as far as how he kept things around his house, either in the house or the lawn or things around him?
John was very meticulous. Everything had its place.
Now, when you arrived there on the morning of the 29th, Mr. O'Keefe's vehicle wasn't parked in that position, correct?
Correct.
From sort of the outside of the residence, were you aware of there being any sort of security cameras or anything affixed to the house of White Meadows Ave at that time?
Yes.
And how were you aware of that?
John told us I don't remember, years prior, I believe, he came over and he was so excited that he got in a ring and he would always show us it. He just is always watching.
And when he would show you that, how would he show you? Like on what kind of device?
On his phone.
So he had a ring application hooked up to himself.
Yes.
Now, with respect to that morning when you arrived, if you could, using the laser pointer, just sort of delineate for the jury whereabouts you had parked Ms. Reed's vehicle when you pulled in and you see it in the photo.
So it would be right there because John's car was further over.
Mr. O'Keefe's car was further over to the fence.
Towards the fence, yes.
And so when you arrived there, you're looking at the taillight, and at some point you go in the house, correct?
Correct.
How did you get into the house that morning?
The right garage door was open.
Now, is that something normal as far as when you get to Mr. O'Keefe's house and the garage door is open in a snowstorm?
No.
And so you go in through the garage door and then you go into the house, correct?
Yes.
And it's going to be taken. So, Mr. Gabe, if you could describe to the jury sort of how you, when you come in through that right garage door and you start going to the house, what is it when you see when you first come into the house, and what is sort of the layout of Mr. O'Keefe's house?
You walk in from the garage and there's a mudroom.
And typically when you would walk into Mr. O'Keefe's house, what, if anything, would you or anyone else do when they walked into his house?
Take off your shoes.
And why was it?
He didn't want dirt or that morning snow probably getting all over his house.
And so that was a pretty well-known rule for anybody that spent any time at his house on Meadows Ave.
Yes.
And so when you and Ms. Roberts and Ms. Reed walk into the home that morning, into the mudroom, what did you do? What did Ms. Roberts do? What did Ms. Reed do?
I took off my boots or shoes, whatever I had on. Kerry Roberts took off. Karen just ran straight in the house.
You and Ms. Roberts both took off your shoes, and Ms. Reed then just walked in the house with boots or shoes or whatever she was wearing on.
Yes.
And then once you get into the house, where is it that the three of you went respectively once you got in?
We all dispersed. I looked in the TV room where there is a couch. Then I kind of walked through a dining room, and then I peeked into a living room. I went upstairs. I looked in John's room. Harry was also running around different rooms, and then I went into Kaylee's room.
And during this time when you and Ms. Roberts are sort of going around room from room, what was the defendant?
I'm not sure.
When you see her doing the same thing that you were doing?
No.
Now, with respect to, you went at least peeked into John's bedroom, is that right?
Yes.
What, if anything, did you note about the bed when you looked at it?
It was made.
And so then you go into Kaylee's room and check on her, correct?
Yes.
And at any point in time, did you see Patrick at any point?
No.
And were you aware of where Patrick was, or did you know at that point?
At that point, I believe Kaylee told me he was at a sleepover.
So you have some conversation with Kaylee, is that right?
Yes.
And about how long a conversation did you have with Kaylee?
Probably about a few minutes.
And when you left from Kaylee, what is it that you said to her as you were leaving?
Objection.
Apologize.
I promised Kaylee. I promised Kaylee that I would find John and everything was going to be okay.
So after that, where did the three of you go from there?
After that, the three of us got in the car and we drove to Fairview.
And when you say you got into the car, which part of the game?
Kerry's.
Now, may I approach?
Yes.
Again, I'm showing you two photographs again. If you could just look at those and look up when you finish. Did you recognize what's in those photographs?
Yes.
And what do you recognize those to be?
The defendant's vehicle.
And may I approach?
Yes.
You want to call them up to seek to introduce them as the next two exhibits?
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
With the court's permission, if I could publish those here as well. Mr. Kay, what's depicted in this photograph is the defendant Ms. Reed's vehicle, correct?
Correct.
And in sort of focus here is the right rear passenger side of that vehicle, correct?
Correct.
And the tail light, if you could, with the laser pointers, just direct your attention to where you observe that. Now, with respect to what's depicted in this photograph as far as any damage that you observed to this tail light area on the rear passenger side, is that consistent with what you observed in the driveway at One of Meadows Ave when the defendant was showing?
Correct. Minus the snow, etc.
And Ms. Gilman, if I could have the next exhibit. And again, you recognize what's depicted in this photograph?
Yes.
And this is essentially a closer image of that same rear passenger side tail light area, correct?
Yes.
Again, what's depicted in this is that consistent with what you observed minus sort of the caked in snow when you were in the driveway of Mr. O'Keefe's house on the morning of the 29th.
Yes.
Gilman, you can take that down. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask to publish just a short portion of, actually, I'm sorry. If I could publish a portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 6, which is the ring camera from the driveway.
Okay.
Ms. Gilman, if I could have video number 154 from the driveway. Mr. K, direct your attention up to the screen. What's been marked as Exhibit 6 or video from Exhibit 6? Do you recognize what's depicted in this video?
I do.
What do you recognize?
That's myself getting out of the car at Meadows Ave.
Is that essentially where you parked Ms. Reed's vehicle when you pulled in?
Yes.
If you could, just direct the jury's attention with the laser pointer as to where Ms. Reed's vehicle is that you parked and if you see Ms. Roberts' vehicle.
That is Miss Reed's, and that would be Miss Roberts.
And as far as the right garage door that you entered in the house, if you could direct the jury's attention to whereabouts that would, I know it's not on the video, but where would it be?
Walk straight.
So if you could run this in the fire. Mr. Cade, what was depicted in that video, is that consistent with what you observed, the weather conditions to be around the time that you arrived at Mr. O'Keefe's house?
Yes.
And lastly, in this line, Your Honor, if I, with the court's permission, could publish just a very short portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 41.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, if I could ask you to fast forward this to about 2 hours and 10 minutes. Stop there. And again, what's in this video, do you recognize that, Mr. Cade?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize that?
That is John's house.
I'm just going to play from this. Now, what's depicted in this video, sort of the screen directly in front of you, do you recognize that?
Yes.
And what do you recognize that?
John's driveway.
As far as what, if anything, do you observe in John's driveway?
John's car and Karen's car.
And where, if you could, using the laser pointer, just direct your attention to where is defendant's car and where is Mr. O'Keefe's?
Mr. O'Keefe's car and the defendant's.
And where you observe the defendant's car to be, is that essentially where you parked it at that time?
Yes.
Now, may I have a moment?
Okay.
Now, Mr. Cade, as far as what you observe from what you can on the screen right now, the condition of the passenger side tail light, is that consistent with what you observed when you parked the vehicle there sometime earlier that morning?
It's kind of hard to see from this distance.
And just, if you could, lastly, just with the laser pointer, direct your attention to where in the video you see the rear passenger side tail light. Okay. Just go and do your thing. Now, Mr. Cade, you then, yourself, the defendant, and Ms. Roberts then get into Ms. Roberts' vehicle, is that correct?
Yes.
Who's seated where within Ms. Roberts' vehicle as you're going from Meadows Ave? Or what was the plan, and where were you going sort of first when you left Meadows Ave?
We were going to Fairview
And why were you going to Fairview?
because Karen kept screaming, we need to go to Fairview.
Now, who was seated where within the vehicle when you did?
Kerry was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and Karen was in the back.
And what were the lighting conditions at this point that you're driving over there?
It was hard to see out the window. You really had to be kind of staring out. It was dark. The snow was coming out the car.
And as you're making that drive, or as Ms. Roberts is making that drive from Meadows Ave to Fairview, about how long a drive is it?
Approximately 10 minutes. I mean, with the weather, the lights, the street lights, I would say about 10 minutes, give or take.
And as far as during the drive from Meadows Ave to Fairview, what's going on inside the car over the course of that ride?
Karen is in between us, like from the back, kind of pushing up in between Kerry and myself. And she's just screaming, Kerry, Kerry, her name over and over, my name over and over, and repeating certain phrases. Could I have hit him? Did I hit him? Kerry is yelling at her to shut up, to sit back, to buckle up, to look for John.
And while this is going on, what, if anything, are you and Ms. Roberts doing in the front seat of the car?
She's slowly driving, and I'm just peering out the window, looking for John. I mean, it was a crazy situation. She's screaming, he didn't come home. Could he be walking home? Where is he? So we're just looking out the window, looking for John.
Now, during the time that this is going on, Ms. Reed is sort of screaming in between you. Was that continuous, or what, if anything, else did you see her doing in the back seat while you were going from Meadows Ave?
I didn't see her doing anything. She just continuously screamed that. And then as we got by different landmarks, she then started, screaming, asking if John could be at certain people's houses.
And whose houses was she asking if John could be at?
If she could be at Bella's house.
Referring to the directions that you had provided the night before?
Correct.
And so that would have been, Bella was a child who was around the age of Kaylee and your daughter, correct?
Yes.
And there have been some years in the past dating relationship between Mr. O'Keefe and Bella's mother, correct?
Yes.
And so Ms. Reed is saying that in the car that morning as you're driving over to Fairview?
Yes, she asked, could he have been with Ashley? And I looked at her and said no, because to me that was a crazy idea. And then Kerry had mentioned, do you think he could have called somebody else that lived on a street over? And she started screaming, who's that? Who's she?
And you recall who Kerry referred to?
Yes.
And who was that?
A woman that John had previously dated.
And was that anywhere recent in time to when you're driving around on January 29th? When they had dated?
No.
So similar to Bella's mother would have been years before?
Correct.
And so when Ms. Roberts said that, what, if anything, did the defense?
She was just spiraling, yelling about Ashley, who was Bella's mom, and just talking what I thought was very irrational about John maybe being with her.
So you're looking around outside of the vehicle as the vehicle is going down towards Fairview, is that correct?
Yes.
And do you recall how it was that Ms. Roberts came about coming to Fairview similar to the night before? Did she come in from the Chapman side or from the Cedar Crest side?
Chapman.
And as the vehicle turns from Chapman onto Fairview, what, if any, conversation was going on at that point?
Well, Bella lives on that street, so that was when that conversation was being had. Also, just a continuation. It was just like continuous screaming of our names, Carrie screaming at her to sit back, and then sometimes she would sit back and almost like be quiet for a minute, and then it would start all over again.
Now, as you were coming down Fairview Road, what, if anything, were you saying to Ms. Roberts, did Ms. Roberts know where she was going as far as where your sister lived?
No, I told her that my sister lived at the bottom, and then as we got closer, I said, you know, just past, see where those trees are? Just past the trees is my sister's house.
And as you got in that area of sort of the trees, from the residence of your sister at 34 Fairview Road, trees that you're talking about, where are they in relation to the property?
They're at the start of the property is the trees, and then their property begins.
And so the flagpole area and fire hydrant that you were talking about in earlier exhibits, is that in the same area as the trees?
Yes, a little. It goes the trees, and then the fire hydrant. You know, then further up is the fire hydrant and the flagpole.
As you're coming down Fairview now, approaching 34 Fairview, the house would be on which side of the vehicle, on the driver's side or the passenger side?
The driver's side.
And as you approach that area where the trees and the flagpole and the fire hydrant were, what, if anything, happens then?
We drive past the flagpole area, and all of a sudden, Karen starts screaming, there he is, and she's banging to get out.
And banging on the door in the backseat?
Yes.
And at the time that she's saying this, were you able to see anything outside of the vehicle?
I saw nothing.
And what, if anything, when she's banging and kicking the door, banging on the door, what did Ms. Roberts do?
Miss Roberts unlocked the door. Karen got out. Miss Roberts looked at me and said something like, she's crazy or she's batshit crazy, something like that.
And when the defendant gets out of the vehicle, where is it that she goes?
She just runs
And runs with?
straight to John.
And again, when she's running, at this point in time, can you see what she's running toward or where she's going or anything that she's talking about?
I was on the passenger side, so as I got out, she was already at John.
So she gets out and essentially makes a beeline over to where John was,
Correct.
and you're getting out of the passenger side, and by the time you come around the car, she's already there.
Yes.
And when she gets over there, what, if anything, could you see at that point?
She straddles John, and she lifts up his shirt, and then she lifted up her shirt and went to lay on him. And Miss Roberts went over, and she was removing the snow from his face.
Let me take a step back from that just for a moment. And Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask to publish just a portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 12.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Cave, I'm going to direct your attention up to the screen what's been marked as Exhibit 12, and I know this is not something that pertains to your vehicle or anything else. But what I'm going to ask you as it plays through is if what you observed in this video is consistent with what you observed during the drive to Fairview Road Avenue. I'm just going to be quick play. As this video is running, Mr. McCabe, if I could just ask what you see in this video, is that consistent with sort of the lighting and the conditions weather-wise that you observed when Ms. Roberts is driving from Meadows Ave to Fairview?
Yes.
Mr. McCabe, do you recognize whereabouts in town Canton this perspective flag-wise as far as what street or where it is, any landmarks that you observed in the video?
Yes, that is Cassie. We just passed Cassie's Corner Store, and that is Chapman Street.
Again, Ms. McCabe, do you recognize whereabouts in the town of Canton we are in this portion of the video?
Yes,
Where are we?
this is the top of Fairview.
So this will be from Chapman coming on to Fairview, is that correct?
Correct.
And prior to that, along that ride along Chapman, is that the period of time where you're looking out the window and trying to see if you can see John on the side of the road?
Yes, but we didn't drive that way.
You came from the other direction?
Yes,
You would have been taking instead of a right onto Fairview, you would have been taking a left on Fairview?
yes.
And just tell me if you could. Now, what's up on the screen and what you just observed as far as the ride down Fairview, is that fair and accurate material consistent with what you observed and Ms. Roberts was driving down that morning?
Yes,
And at this point in time, as you're coming sort of down the hill from Fairview, is this the point that conversation occurs as far as Bella's mother and prior dating relationships and things like that?
a little bit more towards the top of the street.
So Bella's mother lives more closer to the top like that?
Midway down, yes.
Just go in if you could. The vehicle in the roadway there, do you recognize that?
Yes,
And what do you recognize that to be?
Miss Roberts.
Just for clarification purposes, with the laser pointer, if you could direct your attention to where you see Ms. Roberts. Now, the area where you observed Mr. O'Keefe, can you see that in this particular pause frame of the video?
Not in this frame, I cannot. It's not clear.
Show me if you could. You see that area now?
Yes,
Go ahead using the laser pointer, just direct your attention where. Just give me if you could play this for.
Huh?
If you could, fast forward just about a minute. Right. Right. And then you pause. Okay, do you recognize any of the individuals up on that screen?
yes.
And if you could, with the laser pointer, direct your attention. Who do you recognize and who do you recognize that?
Carrie Roberts, myself, Karen Reed.
Okay. Don't you can take that. Now, Mr. Cave, if I could just take you back to when you arrived there, communicated Ms. Reed goes over to Mr. O'Keefe, Ms. Roberts. What is it that you were doing at that time?
I got out of the car and I came around, and for a second or two, I completely just froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then Carrie and I made eye contact, and I called 911. And Carrie was asking me to go to the car and get, she was yelling to get towels or blankets or something out of the back of her car.
Is that why the back of the car is opened up in the video that we just saw in reference to Ms. Roberts' vehicle?
Yes,
Did she direct you sort of where to go within the vehicle to find the blankets or towels, whatever it was?
yes,
Now, you called 911, you spoke to the operator and told them essentially where you were, correct?
yes.
Now, as far as that initial, what you saw, that you froze and couldn't believe what you saw, can you describe to the jury what it was that you saw?
I saw Carrie wiping the snow off of John's face, and I could not believe that that was John laying there.
And how was John positioned, or how was his body positioned when you saw him?
He was just laying flat on his back.
And as far as the snow Ms. Roberts was wiping off his face, was there any other snow on his body at that time?
Yes,
And if you know about how much?
there was enough that his body was covered in snow.
And could you tell at that point how far Mr. O'Keefe was from the roadway as far as Fairview Road was concerned?
I mean, I remember kind of a little ways in. I don't know Exactly.
And so you make that call to 911, and what is sort of going on with respect to Ms. Roberts, the defendant, and Mr. O'Keefe while you're on that 911?
So I run the blankets over to Miss Roberts, and she's kind of lifts him up, put the blankets underneath him, and she's screaming at Miss Reed to get off of Mr. O'Keefe. And they're kind of yelling back and forth. Karen screaming, "Is he dead? Is he dead?" I, at some points, walk over towards the car, Carrie's car, to get away because they're so loud. And I was trying to be calm and get help there for John as fast as possible. Carrie starts yelling about doing CPR. She tells Karen to do mouth to mouth. Karen's yelling because as they start, blood starts coming out of John's mouth.
As far as the CPR, that's what you're talking about?
Yes.
So during this time, the defendant's yelling, and you're on the phone with 911, correct?
Yes.
So you're trying to back up or distance yourself a little bit so that you can hear what's going on with the 911 operator, and they can hear you.
Yes.
And after you complete that 911 call, what's going on with that?
I go over, and at that point, Carrie asks if I can take over doing the compressions.
And did you do that?
I did, yes.
And at some point after you call 911, do either police or fire or someone responds and arrives on scene, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know about how much time it was in between when you hung up with 911 and when the first responders started to arrive?
From when I hung up, maybe a few minutes. I'm not exactly sure.
And do you recall whether or not it was police or fire who showed up first?
Police.
And was that the officer that was in that video or that cruiser that was just up on the screen as the last?
I didn't see the officer in the video, but I know it was Officer Sarah was the first officer to arrive.
And so then, after the officer arrives, what happened then?
He was trying to figure out what had happened. Karen just ran around screaming my name, Carrie's name. Is he dead? Is he dead? It was on repeat. Could I have hit him? Did I hit him? More officers started to arrive. The EMTs, they began to work on him.
And while by him you mean Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
And Mr. O'Keefe's still on the ground, and they're working on him there, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you see anything about sort of what they were doing or what was going on with that?
No, I just saw a bunch of them around Mr. O'Keefe.
And then what happened then?
More officers began to arrive. And Miss Reed just continued to run around screaming. As more officers and EMT arrived, they asked what happened. One EMT asked,
I'll allow it.
one EMT had asked, his name, his age, things like that. If she knew what happened, Miss Reed stated that she hit him. Besides running around saying, I hit him, did I hit him, could I have done this? Is he dead? Is he dead? At one point, one of the police officers put Miss Reed in the back of her cruiser, and he asked for myself to go over with her, and Carrie came over with us as well.
I'd like to just take you back to when the paramedic is asking for information, biographical information, things like that. You indicated that the defendant said, I hit him, is that correct?
Yes.
Is that something that she said once or more than once?
3 times. I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
Now, before you had made reference to statements she made with sort of qualifiers or questions as far as could I have hit him or did I hit him? Is that what she said at that time when she was speaking to the paramedic?
No, she was earlier. It was could I, did I. When she spoke to the paramedic, it was crystal clear. I hit him.
Now, one of the officers takes her over to the back of a cruiser, is that right?
Yes.
You were over in that area as well?
Yes.
And who, if anyone else, was over in that area?
Miss Roberts.
And while you were over in that area, what was going on?
We were in the back of the police cruiser. Karen was sitting in there. I kind of scooched myself in. Miss Roberts came over. Karen grabbed our hands. She asked us to pray. She looked at her hands and she had blood. She asked us if she could have gotten her period. We told her no, that was John's blood. Then she said, what if he's dead? Promise me you'll take care of the kids. Someone's going to take care of the kids. Then we prayed. Then at the end, they were moving John, and at that point, Karen told Carrie, go over, look, is he dead? Is he dead? Is he dead? Over and over. And Carrie said, I'll go over and check on him. And she was yelling, are they working on him? And then at that point, she grabbed my hands and she said, Google hypothermia, Google how long it takes to die in the cold. And so I had my phone out and it was cold and my hands were frozen and I have MS, and I took my phone out while she was screaming and shaking my arm, and I attempted to Google how long does it take to die in the cold.
And when you conducted that search, that was at the defendant's request on scene sometime after 6 a.m. on that day, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall whether or not that came up as far as you're searching Google? Is it something that you typed once or more than once? If you
I believe I did it multiple times because as I was typing it, I don't know what else was coming up. She was screaming. My hands were shaking.
And do you recall anything as far as what the search results were, or did you click on anything, or did you get an answer to the question the defendant had posed to you?
I don't even think I got an answer because as I kept Googling and she kept yelling and then they were moving John. And the next thing I knew, we were kind of moving because she wanted to see if they were working on him.
And so you were moving along with the defendant over towards where Mr. O'Keefe had gone to the back of the ambulance?
Yes, we kind of just moved to see what was going on.
When you moved over, what did you see then?
They were just putting him in the back of the ambulance.
Now, after Mr. O'Keefe was put into the back of the ambulance, where did you go then? What did you do?
At that point, different police officers, I believe, were arriving and they were asking questions about what happened.
And did you speak to those officers?
I did, yes.
And at that point, did you know what happened?
No, to be honest, it was like I was there, but everything was just going on and I was completely just in a state of shock and disbelief.
And that sort of period there, how long did that go on?
So I talked to a few officers. We tried to just give them, he didn't come home. We went out looking for him, kind of just the brief overview. And then one of the police officers asked me to go into the house and to wake up my sister and my brother-in-law.
And at some point while you were outside, did you try to contact your sister and your brother-in-law?
I believe I called my sister, Nicole.
And when was that in relation to everything as far as medically that was going on with Mr. O'Keefe and all?
I think I might have called her right after I got off with 911 possibly. And then, she didn't answer. And that's when I was walking over, I believe, to John.
And she didn't answer the call when you called her initially?
No.
And you recall calling either your sister Nicole or your brother-in-law Brian Albert prior to going into the house?
I don't recall. I know I did call Nicole at one point. I'm not sure if I called Brian or not.
Regardless of if you called or you didn't call, do you recall having any sort of phone conversation with either Nicole or Brian Albert before you went in the house?
No.
So you at least called your sister Nicole, she didn't answer, and then one of the officers directed you to wake them up.
Yes.
And when you went up to the house at 34 Fairview, how did you get in?
The front door.
And the front door was unlocked?
Yes.
Is that typical from your experience at that residence?
Yes.
And so you went to the house, and where did you go?
I went up the stairs to their bedroom.
And the bedroom door, when you arrived there, was it open or closed or something?
Closed.
And you opened it?
Yes.
And when you opened it, who, if anyone, did you see in the room, and what were they doing?
I saw my sister and Brian, and they were both asleep.
And you familiar with a dog that they have?
Yes.
What was the dog's name?
Chloe?
Was Chloe in the bedroom as well at that time?
I don't recall.
You come in, they're both sleeping, and what happened then?
I go over to the bed, and I'm calling out their names.
And how long were you calling out their names before you got any kind of response?
Brian responded first, and he was very, startled and looked at me like, what is going on? Nicole took a little, I think it took Nicole a little bit longer than Brian to wake up.
And what is it that you're telling them as you're coming into the room and they're waking up?
I'm telling them that we just found John out front. And I could have possibly said, John has died. We just found John out front. They were very confused. At one point, I think Brian was like, who's John? I mean, they had just woken up and they had no idea what I was talking about.
Now, as far as when they're first waking up and you're explaining to them, how would you describe sort of their demeanor as you're talking?
They were both shocked. I think they thought, like, why?
Not what you think they thought.
Okay.
But what I'm asking them is just sort of when you observe them, how would you describe your physical observations of what they look like, their demeanor in that respect?
Shocked, confused, not understanding.
Objection, move to strike.
Strike the last one.
Now, as far as this conversation that you're having with your sister and your brother-in-law in their bedroom, how long was that going on?
A few minutes, at least.
And then following that, where did you go?
They got up, got dressed, and then we walked down the stairs.
And when you got to the bottom of the stairs, what, if anything, did you see when you got there?
There was a police officer at the bottom of the stairs.
And do you know who that police officer is?
Yes, Officer Lank.
At that time, did you know who that police officer was?
I did, yes.
How did you know?
He's from Canton. He was, 5 years older than me. I knew him kind of growing up, who he was, and met him through the years.
You're aware of who he was?
Yes.
And were there any other officers with him initially?
No.
Now, before you go into the house, do you know where Ms. Roberts and the defendant were, or what they were doing when you went to the house?
I believe they put Karen in a car, and I...
Only if you know. Only if you
Okay.
If you know. Do you know?
Karen was in a car. Kerry was walking all around.
Now, as far as the ambulance with Mr. O'Keefe, at the time that you go into the house, was that ambulance still there?
I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it had left.
And when you come downstairs with your sister and your brother-in-law, and the officer's there, you have a conversation, is that correct?
Yes.
Where did that first conversation occur?
In the hallway, and then into the kitchen.
And from there, you mentioned that there was Officer Lank at one point. Were there any other officers that joined that conversation at some point?
Hours later, yes.
And so during that initial conversation, you're talking to the officer, who, if anyone else, not what they said, but who, if anyone else, is speaking to the officer.
Brian and Nicole.
Now, the conversation initially with the officer, do you know about how long that went on?
I don't. A few minutes.
And following that conversation, what did you do or what happened?
My husband arrived.
And had you called him?
Yes.
And when had you called him?
I called him when I was walking in the house to wake up my sister and Brian.
So as you're walking in, you call your husband Matt, and then he arrives at some point after. Is it after you're done talking to the officer or while you're talking to the officer?
The officer was still in the house, yes.
And so in that vein, as far as when your husband comes in, the officer's there, correct?
Yes.
Did you see your husband talking to the officer as well?
Yes, the officer asked him to step outside or step to the side, and they spoke.
And then what happened then?
The officer told me to stay.
I'll allow that. I told her to stay.
The officer told me to stay, and that he said that the state police would be coming to talk to me.
And so you stayed at the house at 34 Fairview, is that right?
Yes.
You know where Ms. Robertson, the defendant, is?
Yes, Carrie came up, and she had told me that she...
No, but she told you. Next question, Mr. Miller.
At some point, did you see Ms. Robertson, the defendant, go?
Yes, to pick up John's parents.
Objection, move to strike.
I'll strike that.
And as far as they left in Ms. Roberts' car, is that right?
Correct.
Ms. Roberts was again driving.
Correct.
And at some point, did you observe them come back to the house?
Yes.
And about how long was it between the time they left and the time they came back to the house?
5 minutes, approximately.
And after they came back to the house, what, if any, other activity did you see outside as far as first responders?
I was in the house, so I didn't see Miss Roberts pull back up.
You were in the house for most of the rest of the time that you were there, is that correct?
Correct.
And how long were you there that morning waiting for the safety?
I believe I left approximately 11:30.
During the time that you were there, you're there, your sister Nicole Albert's there, your brother-in-law Brian Albert's there, and your husband Matthew McCabe's there, correct?
Correct.
And was there anybody else that arrived at some point over the course of the morning while you were there at the house?
Yes.
And who was that? And if you know about what time was it that they arrived?
Julie Albert.
Now, with reference to when Julie Albert arrived, at some point around that time, did you have occasion to look out and see sort of what was going on outside?
No.
Were you aware whether or not there were any police or fire or anything that was still there at the time that Miss Julie Albert arrived?
There wasn't.
And she comes in the house, and at some point, I'm assuming she's informed of what had transpired there before her arrival, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
And when she's informed of that, what, if anything, did you observe about her demeanor or how she reacted?
Shocked.
Now, in addition to Julie Albert, who, if anyone else, was at the house that morning while you were there?
Officer Lank and Gallagher were there. And Brian Higgins came that morning.
And do you know how Brian Higgins came to know or how Brian Higgins came to be there that morning? Did you know?
I don't know.
Now, you mentioned that Officer Lank came back to the house, is that right?
Yes.
That was after some period of time when he had left?
Yes.
He came back with another officer named Gallagher, is that right?
Yes.
And why did they come back to the house? If you know?
Because I called Officer Lank.
And did you have his number, or how did you get his number if you did?
Julie Albert gave it to me.
And so you called Officer Lank, he then comes back to the house on Fairview, is that right?
Yes.
And when he came back, what is it that why had you asked him to come back?
Well, as I was sitting there and I was waiting for the state police to come, I was slowly trying to piece together what had just happened in the last couple of hours. And he had told me, if there's anything that you remember, if you remember anything, please, give me a call.
And so there was something that you remembered and you gave him a call.
Yes.
And when he came back to the house, what was it that you told him?
I told him about the comments and the remarks that Karen Reed had been stating that morning.
And specifically, what type of remarks are you referring to that you told Officer Lank when he came back to the house?
I said that she told one of the EMTs that she hit him.
Now, at some point, you indicated that you left the house on Fairview, is that right?
Yes.
And with your husband, I presume?
Yes.
And where did the two of you go?
We went home.
And your children were still there without either you or your husband there, is that correct?
Yes.
And once you arrived back home, what is it that you did at that?
We went in the house, and Officer Proctor was coming over to speak with us.
And that Officer Proctor, is that someone that you knew previously or had ever met before?
I'd never met Officer Proctor.
And did he come alone or was he with someone else?
He had another officer with him.
You know who that officer is?
Yes, Yuri Buchanan.
And have you ever met Yuri Buchanan?
No.
When you get home, about how long was it at the time from when you arrived home with your husband to the time that the officers from the state police came by?
It was pretty quick.
Now, in addition to the officers from the state police, did anybody else come over to your house on that day, late morning, early afternoon?
Yes, my brother-in-law, Brian.
And do you know why he came over there?
Yes, he came over. I had asked him. He's like a big brother to me, and I was all shaken up and nervous, and overwhelmed, and so I wanted his support.
And he obliged and he came over, correct?
Yes,
Now, at some point after the officers from the state police came over, you spoke to them, is that correct?
yes,
And do you recall where in your home you spoke to them?
in my dining room.
Now, when you spoke to them, was it both of the officers that were present?
Yes,
And was there anybody else present in the dining room when you were talking?
no,
And as far as your husband or your brother-in-law, Brian, do you know where in the house they were when you were in the dining room?
yes, they were in my bedroom.
And at some point later on that day, those same officers talked to both your husband and your brother-in-law, Brian.
Yes,
And during each of those respective conversations or interviews, do you know where you were in the house when those were going on?
in my bedroom.
And when you were in your bedroom, could you hear anything that they were saying downstairs in the dining room?
No,
Let me have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm showing you two separate pages, just ask you to look at each of them and then look at whenever you're finished.
okay.
You recognize each of those documents and what the content is?
Yes,
And those are essentially, one contains text messages that morning of the 29th between yourself and Ms. Reed, correct?
yes,
And the other one is sort of the list of phone calls between yourself and Ms. Reed from that morning as well.
yes.
Now, before I get into those, as far as after you had gone inside the house and Ms. Reed had gotten into Ms. Roberts' car, what if any other communication or what if any other communication did you have with Ms. Reed that morning?
I texted her asking for Carrie's phone number because I didn't have it, and I also had a phone conversation with Karen when she was in the ambulance.
And that text communication that I placed before you essentially has one bubble on it, and that's you asking for Carrie Roberts' number.
Correct.
And the phone conversation that you had with the defendant, when was that, and you know where the defendant was at the time that you spoke?
Yes, she was in an ambulance.
And if you could describe to the jury sort of what, generally speaking, what was the content of that conversation? What did the two of you talk about?
She just was repeating, asking if he was dead. Is he dead? She brought up the kids, and then she also asked if I would visit her.
And how did you respond?
I said yes.
Now, following that phone conversation, did you have any further communication in any form that you can recall with the defendant?
No.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
I want the seat to introduce and admit each of those as an extra exhibit.
Is there an objection, Mr. Jackson?
No objection, Your Honor.
Any particular order?
Doesn't matter, whichever.
Text first, please.
Oh.
Is it 94? 95.
Just a couple more questions, ma'am. Now, you had asked the defendant, Ms. Reed, for Ms. Roberts' information because you didn't have it, correct?
Correct.
And at some point, did you receive that information from the defendant?
No.
And did you receive that information from any other source?
I must have, but I don't recall how.
And as far as asking for Ms. Roberts' information, why were you asking?
She was on the way to pick up John's parents and to bring him to the hospital, and I wanted to check in on them, and then further updates from Carrie about John and how he was.
You wanted to know how your friend was doing, correct?
Yes.
System.
No further questions to this witness.